Hey there, Sean. Thanks for coming on the show today, and really excited to be diving into the topic of Android versus iOS development. And for anyone out there who isn't super familiar with you yet, can you just share a bit on like your background? And just as we were chatting before this, you are definitely professional in this. So can you just kind of share your role with Majestyk, and it seems like why you've had this conversation so many times?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jake. So my personal background, I have a master's in computer science and started Majestyk. It's actually our 10-year anniversary this month. So we've been around for 10 years, and I've been doing mobile development for about 12 at this point. Professionally, I'm an iOS developer by trade. And day to day, I lead a team of about 45 people that work on a mix of mobile-focused applications, whether that be native mobile apps, hybrid applications, web applications that are mobile-focused, and we also do web infrastructure, etc., to work with those native iOS and Android apps that we do build.
Yeah. And just for the perspective of the audience out there, just because I know you are working at a very high level, I mean, who are some of the clients you've worked with and some of the biggest apps out there that you've worked on? Because I do know you guys have a pretty incredible client roster and just list of projects you've worked on. Could you maybe just share a few of those just to give the audience perspective on what the kind of projects you've been working on?
Yeah, of course. I kind of like to say we have kind of three buckets that we work with of partner type. So the first bucket are really high growth startups. So some of those that we are working with consistently and long term are, and we've discussed some of these on the channel before. One is AudioMac. We've been working with them for about 6+ years now, and have grown with them from about 5,000 monthly active users to about a little over 20 million monthly active users now. Life Dojo, which is I guess they're not even a startup now. We've been working with them for about 4 years, and they recently were acquired by a public company. So I guess they're technically in a different bucket now. Another one that's actually getting some press in this week is a company called Black Sands. And we've been working with them for about a year and a half. Second bucket are really larger enterprise clientele, usually 1,000 employees or 500 to 1,000 employees. And I kind of call them like mid-market. So a lot of these are more traditional companies. Some of them have been Action Carting, which is a waste management company, Bolt Insurance, which is a pretty large insurance company. So a number of companies in that kind of realm of that employee range or size. And then the last are really the higher market cap, larger Fortune, like 1,000, as well as just public companies in general. So we've done things for like IBM, Citibank, Pepsi, Chick-fil-A, Chevy. Some of these are focused on their core products and core offering, and sometimes it's focused on marketing-esque type campaigns and things of that nature where we're working with different teams in the organization. So those are the three buckets, really.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in on the topic then. I just want to kind of share that just for the credibility as you guys face these conversations a lot. But, you know, when a company or a startup or anybody is going out to start their mobile project and they're choosing, Android versus iOS, where do we start? How do we think about this? What are you typically saying to a company whenever they come to you with that question and they're trying to figure out how to navigate that path forward?
Yeah, so choosing iOS versus Android has been a question for I guess, years now, since like the inception of like mobile development. It's always, what do we do first? Why? And now you're also getting the conversation of, should we go hybrid so we can get the best of both worlds? And there is no one size fits all answer for this. It's an it depends answer. There's so many different factors, but really to start, so doing the upfront strategy in terms of what we call discovering a strategy, we figure out kind of what your target demographic is and your customers, like what is their what's that user base look like, what phones, devices are they using, so we can then reverse engineer what the best path forward is. So if we find that if your target demographic is US only and in a specific area where we find that maybe 75 or 80% or more are using iPhones, and you're looking to just build or test a initial MVP, we may say, let's go with an iOS app and let's do it natively. So there's a number of factors, but that's just one initial potential outcome. But we always the first thing that I always look at is like your customers' demographic and like what is happening currently. And then from there, there's a number of other factors in terms of like what does the team structure look like that's going to be supporting it? What is the feature set? I would say that's the biggest, is how complicated is this application in terms of functionality, like do we need really heavy OS level items that are specific to Android or specific to iOS, because there are things that you can do on each platform that you cannot do on the other. Android tends to be a lot more open. It's considered more open source versus iOS, where you're more or less kind of controlled by Apple and their rules, regulations. But there are things that you can access that a bit easier on iOS versus Android. So there's definitely some pros and cons there.
Could you maybe share, like, what are some of those examples of things that may kind of tilt the scale on that?
Yep. So unlike the Android side, in terms of the openness, you definitely have access to do more, and like you can build your own, like for example, it's easier to build like custom firmware. You can build more applications that get intertwined with the root of the phone, and what I mean that, or the root like applications of the phone, I guess is a better way to say it. So unlike iOS, there's a number of different messaging apps. I guess that's a good example. So there's different messaging apps on Android that you can use as your core like messenger, versus iOS where you have iMessage, and that's kind of the de facto default that you have to rely on. But then now there's third parties like WhatsApp, WeChat, Telegram, Discord, Slack, etc. that are built for both platforms that people use. So, but that is kind of one differentiator, one potential example of a differentiator. So it's more open where you can access, I would say, more lower level things like messaging, like different, like under the hood they're called like different APIs or just different services that are available on Android that aren't on iOS. And Apple has caught up a bit. Like Android has the concept of like widgets and whatnot for years. iOS has caught up recently with like their different extensions and things of that nature, but you're still kind of in this sandbox where you don't have full control over it. I mean, there is some rules with Android as well, but it's most of the time, like 9 times out of 10, they're not as strict. So I guess the overall outcome here is we tend to see more applications start as iOS apps and then move to Android, if they were to start with one platform instead of both.
Yeah. And is that because is one of the platforms simpler than the other? Would you say iOS is simpler, more straightforward because there's less of those integrations, or why do you find that you're typically starting with iOS and then going to Android?
We tend to find that, like from a development standpoint, in our professional opinion, they're pretty similar in terms of like the development cycle. There's some people that say you can do Android a bit quicker, and it's also definitely opinionated now, especially with like newer things on iOS like Swift UI, which allows you to more or less develop using like more of a graphical interface, which speeds up development time. But at the end of the day, some of the things are, with Android, you're dealing with thousands of devices. With iOS, you're generally dealing with maybe 5, 10, 20 devices, depending on how far backwards you go in terms of the compatibility of the app itself. So are you supporting iOS 13, iOS 14 and above? Like how far back are you going? So generally, it's a bit easier on the development side in terms of the support of Apple, where people and Apple forces updates pretty frequently and often. So you tend to see that most people are on at least one behind, if not the latest operating system or version of iOS. So it makes it so much easier for us as developers to only code for the last two versions or latest version of iOS versus Android, where you see a lot of fragmentation, where there's, like I said, thousands of phones, but then on top of that, depending on the carrier or manufacturer, even if the phone's brand new, it may not have the latest operating system. You may get the phone and then right away it'll ask you to update it. So it's it's not as controlled as Apple. So it tends to have some of these, I wouldn't call them problems, but there's new phones out there without the latest operating system. There's many different manufacturers that have slightly different flavors of the operating system going on, where it definitely changes how apps react. So like whenever we're like actually testing and QAing, takes much longer on Android because we have to test across a larger suite of devices in terms of manufacturers and carriers. So that's definitely something that we take into account. But it is when you're looking at like the actual footprint of Android versus iOS, you tend to see more of a global footprint with Android, which is part of the just dynamic. More people around the globe are using Android devices because some of them are a little bit cheaper versus an iPhone at this point in time, which you're spending over $1,000 on some of the new iPhones, where that's just not attainable for some countries, if they're a emerging country, where they just don't have the resources to purchase a phone of that magnitude, where they're on a little bit older versions of an Android device, or a different, even older version of an iPhone.
Yeah, and so I know we've talked about this previously with AudioMac and just kind of the large number of old devices you had to support there with, I believe from that was like they're one of the top apps in Africa. And so you have this like very, old phone base. You've got a lot of different systems, and so I guess I'm curious, from like a testing and then also a development standpoint, does that mean that with when you're going global and you're needing to support all of those, is that also leading to just a lot more iterations of revisions on the code when you're taking things into test and bringing them back out? Is that going to slow things down, or what are your thoughts on like how that actually, the fact that you're supporting all those, how does that tend to actually impact the development or just even the maintenance of the project?
Yep. So it's actually a huge factor. That's another good example. Bring up AudioMac. They actually have a partnership with one of the carriers over there in Africa, and there's actually a number of devices that this is specific to Android as well. Their app actually comes pre-installed on some devices, so the app itself is kind of similar to iOS. If you have this, when you get an iPhone, you have a suite of Apple apps. When you get an Android device from this carrier, you have AudioMac on there as one of the built-in apps, which is pretty cool, and just not possible on iOS. But in terms of the testing, yes, it's definitely it definitely takes more time. You definitely see more issues around different devices, just depending on like their memory, how much storage they have. It's such a wide range and different compared to iOS, where it's pretty. We know what the average phone has in terms of memory. Storage is pretty standard across devices now, where like at this point some of the new phones are comparable to a computer, say 3-5 years ago. But getting back to the root of your question, we do have to test on so many different devices that are just, you can't even get them here in the States. So we will order these phones that are directly from China, directly from overseas manufacturers that you can't even connect them to a carrier here in the U.S. So we'll just connect them to Wi-Fi, test them that way, or we have to have a suite of device, or we'll use companies that have a suite of device farm, or devices in a device farm, it's called. So basically what that is just like a warehouse of basically phones plugged in so we can access them remotely and just test across some of these more rare phones that we just can't get our hands on, or there's a support or customer support problem where it's only happening on this one phone located in this one location. So we have to target that one phone and see what's going on and try to replicate the problem so then we can support it. And then I guess one last note that we're doing with some products that are global. So a lot of them support like 20 plus languages, and then on top of that, we need to deal with different integrations. So a lot of companies they generate revenue from ads, they generate revenue from subscriptions, and things of that nature. So all that has to be. Some of that's different depending on the location. So the subscription may be a little bit different in the UK versus the US. Then the ad networks that are in the UK versus the US are different, and they'll be targeted different. And then even the ad stack will be different as well. So that's where we can potentially slim the actual size of the app down a bit to make it a bit smaller footprint on some of the smaller or smaller storage and memory capable devices, especially when it comes to Android.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind, I know we kind of hit on this at the beginning, but with looking at the data on, this market, the markets you're going into, what are they using? Are there various sources that you guys are using to gather this kind of data, saying this country or this state or this, region? Like, how do you guys actually gather that information on what phones are being used in what areas?
Yeah, so there's a lot of public information here, and a lot of it comes from the analytics companies. And what I mean by analytics companies, so pretty much any app that we build has some sort of analytics to look at least high level data. So retention, average time in the app, number of uses per day, things like that. But what these companies do is because they have their software development kit is installed on so many different devices around the world, they can aggregate all of that information and then present that publicly. So one of them that comes to mind is Mixpanel. They tend to do a number of public, I guess public charts are the easiest way to explain it. So you can go to their site and they have a page that has a number of different metrics where you can look up like what is the adoption of iOS 15. So you can see that on average, I don't know the exact rate off the top of my head, but we'll say it's at 80% now, which is pretty good for only being out for under 6 months. So there's a lot of open sources like that, and then to go the next level, which is even better if we can, if we're working with a customer that has a customer base already, we can look at their metrics and see. So if they have a website, we can see by looking in their analytics that, all right, it looks like 70% of users are coming from mobile, and from mobile, out of that 70%, 80% of them are coming from iOS devices. So then it's very clear cut that, all right, it makes sense to build an iOS app and works solely there. And then eventually we'll get to the extra 20% to round you out to a full 100% coverage of your customers.
Nice. That's super helpful. And so what other factors are you looking at whenever you're considering that Android versus iOS? Do the app stores, so those make a difference? Are there things around security, or what other factors are you looking at?
Yeah. So I think this also brings in hybrid now. I'll mention that a bit now. So when it comes to like the app stores, when it comes to iOS, Android, or hybrid, there's not any major differences there. Like Apple and Google are different for sure. Google used to be very like hands off, and really there wasn't really even like a submission process. At one point in time, it was more or less you'd just deploy the app to the store and it would be available, and then Google would periodically look for any issues, or they would flag your app if it had bad content or anything of that nature. But now they've gotten a little bit better and have more of a standard submission process. But Apple's very stringent in terms of like what they put in the store, and like they have clear, strict guidelines, and they definitely adhere to them. So it takes some time, generally the first time we submit an app, to get it into the store when it comes to Apple. But more or less, they're looking to fully understand the use case of the product, so they can ensure that it's classified the right way in the App Store under the right categories and section, and is a fit for their store. The other two items in terms of like maintenance, security, that brings into play hybrid as well. So the maintenance piece is always a big factor when you're talking about a hybrid app versus an iOS native or Android native application. So when people bring up the word hybrid, there's many different approaches here, but more or less it's using web or one programming, say one programming, one or a mix of programming languages to build a single code base that can be used across iOS and Android. And it sounds really good on paper to say I have one code base that works on two platforms. The best I've really personally seen is you end up having about 70–80% coverage across both platforms, and then the extra 20–30% you have to do specific for that platform. So whether you're using like web technologies or like JavaScript, HTML, CSS, or you're using like Kotlin, multi-platform, there tends to be some specific native code that you do have to end up writing for iOS or Android. So what I've seen, you really need to have engineers that or developers that know both web or the native language that you're using, like Kotlin, with Kotlin multi-platform, where they understand both the language that they're using, and then they also understand the intricacies of iOS and Android, and how to use both Android Studio, which is what you develop in to build an Android app, and then Xcode, which is what you use for building an iOS app. So there's just a different level of expertise there, and that factors into like the actual maintenance and people needed. So for a native iOS app, you really need an iOS developer. For a native Android app, you need an Android developer. For a hybrid application, you end up needing, depending on the stack, generally a web developer, and then someone who knows iOS and someone who knows Android a little bit. And then there's some people that are out there that can do web, and then they can navigate iOS and Android enough to handle building a hybrid app. But it's rare and far and few between. And most hybrid apps, I don't push or recommend it much unless it makes sense that you may have your website built in React, where then moving to React Native is a lower lift. But there's still things that are pretty difficult to do in React Native. You need to have a bunch of different modules that end up being native code anyway, that are written in Swift or Kotlin or Objective-C and Java, which ends up being pretty complicated and hard to deal with in terms of the actual maintenance and upkeep. So at the end of the day, there's pros and cons. Like this alone, just hybrid versus native, is a long conversation, and it's always specific to the feature set and company, and really what it needs to do. So that's how I'll leave that there. And then in terms of security, to date, iOS has always been like known to be a bit more secure than Android, just kind of going back to the fact that iOS is more locked down by Apple and Android is more open source, and you can kind of do more. You can install custom like OSs, you can do more things that are like technically allowed, and you're not jailbreaking your iPhone to then get access to like apps that are not available in the App Store. Like it takes a lot to do it. Like you gotta be pretty savvy to work your way around doing that, and it then compromises your device a bit in terms of the security level, because you're not as protected by Apple when you do jailbreak your device. There are things to make Android more secure that we employ and that most developers should employ. Like there's tools like ProGuard and DexGuard, which are, and R8 as well, which is really the new version of ProGuard, It's basically, it obfuscates your code to basically kind of almost randomize it a bit. It shrinks it a bit, so it's harder for like hackers to reverse engineer your code to try to hack you. But at the end of the day, it's easier to do this on Android versus iOS. Just the way the operating systems are kind of structured.
All right, that's yeah, there's definitely a lot of factors to consider there, and yeah, I think you brought up a lot of really great points on the hybrid versus kind of the native. And I'm just curious, we don't want to have to dive too far into it, but how often? You said you didn't recommend it often, but I mean, out of the projects you work on, how often do you guys ever go the hybrid route out of like versus the going native?
I would say it's in like the 5 to 10% range.
Okay.
Honestly, closer to the 5%.
And it kind of tends to be in those situations where someone's on the code base where it's just easier to move from there. Maybe it's a lighter app or something like that. Does that kind of tend to be the scenarios? Or
Yep. It's got to be a pretty light app that's not using really any OS level functionality. Maybe a couple things, but not anything too complicated. My one of my big ways to explain this. So Facebook is behind React and React Native, which are one's a big web framework and the other's a big mobile app framework. And React Native is used in Instagram for like a couple screens and in Facebook for like a couple screens. So Facebook, who created this hybrid framework, doesn't even use it for the majority of their applications. So that kind of shows you there that there's some rationale of you're going to get the best overall product experience and product from building it natively.
Yeah, makes sense. So another thing we want to hit on just real quick is, Android versus iOS. It's no longer just a conversation of mobile phones as well as we're now kind of is technology advancing into tablets, home control services, smartwatches, voice control. Security systems, like all these things are kind of starting to connect into these. And so how do you also think about all of these new systems, these new technologies that are emerging and then choosing a platform? As I know there's a lot of companies that are building around these tools as well.
Yep. So this is a very good question. It's very relevant now. So when we're planning an app or planning and doing the strategy around a product, we always think about like what is V2, V3, V4 look like of this product and potentially other products, as you're saying here, or platforms. So we think about it on the onset as much as possible. I mean, you can't always predict that new platforms will be available, but to date now, like Apple and Android are making it easier and easier and easier, or Apple and Google are making it easier to build things that are cross-platform. So when I say that, I mean you can share. So for example, on the iOS side, you can share a lot of your code across iOS, Android, and now, iOS, iPad, or iPhone, iPad, and now even Mac applications, which wasn't the case years ago. So now you can run iPhone and iPad applications on the newer Macs that are running Apple's M1 silicon chips. So it doesn't matter what variant of the chip, but you can now run those applications on your actual computer without any changes. So that's brand new and wasn't around years ago. And then on top of that, you're talking about like you got Android Auto, CarPlay on the iOS side, Apple TV. It really is getting to be a endless. You got Android Wear, Apple Watch, etc. Where once again a lot of the core code can be the same, and then you're really just changing the actual or coding for the actual interface. So a watch interface is completely different than your iPad. So what content can be displayed there is definitely different. And you just have to design for it. And the functionality may not be as robust on a watch versus an iPad, but you can do similar things now. So like this is also going back to different iterations of the operating systems of even those devices. So I'm getting a little into the weeds here, but this is a good example. So the first versions of Watch OS, which is the operating system that runs on the Apple Watch, you couldn't stream directly from the watch. You had to connect your phone to the watch and then stream that way. You can now, with the later versions, you can stream directly to your watch if it has cellular or a connection to the actual internet, it changes the game for like audio applications. So we're always thinking about these things, looking into how we can basically leverage them in the best way possible for whatever product or products that we're building.
Nice. That's incredible. Well, as we're kind of wrapping up here, are there any other final factors or just recommendations you'd make to someone who's considering which route to go with these various platforms?
It's a hard question to figure out, but it comes down to, at the end of the day, there's data that's out there. Look at the data and don't get too emotional about the decision. Like a lot of people want to like start with both, and like you need both, but or they feel like they need both, but sometimes you don't. Like, especially if you're building an initial like MVP or minimal viable product, you want to start with one and test, and then once you really get that product market fit and that the product exactly where you're getting traction and that stickiness where users are not turning away and churning, they're continuing to stay in the app longer and longer and longer, that's when you can expand to the next platform. You don't have to be on both to start. You just want to pick the right one that's right for you based on the data. And that is really, it makes sense for pretty much everything you should be doing from the product standpoint. Everything should be based on actual data, not just an idea. You should be able to validate everything that you're doing, and this is just another example of that.
Nice, that's incredible. Super helpful wisdom and everything. So, Sean, thank you again for taking the time to come on here and share all of this today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me again.